the fact that they didn't get the number of seats that they hoped has made a difference, because many people feared that they will actually then bring about constitutional changes which remove some of the kind of democratic processes that India has enshrined, in its constitution. And also, I think there have been certain laws that have been kind of difficult to pass in Parliament, because now the questions are raised in Parliament. So, for example, although the mainstream media has been by and large overwhelmingly taken over by the Modi regime and its big corporate houses, what was very influential in these last elections was YouTubers who had now, these were journalists who used to be with mainstream media, but who have set up independent news channels, who have set up YouTube channels, who have huge followings, and who are very, very influential in the last election, whose WhatsApp videos, which were critiques of the Modi regime, really spread viral through the country.
So Alpa, your book, The Incarcerations, tells the story of 16 academics, activists, poets, journalists arrested over events that happened in 2018. Tell us an overview of the story and put that in the context of Narendra Modi, the BJP, and what Modi is doing and has done to India on a cultural level.
Yeah. Well, it's this fascinating case where 16 people, well, there were more than 16 that were raided by the Indian police on a series of nights, and electronic evidence was found on their computers, and the police said that these guys are all terrorists, and threw 16 of them into prison, and said that many of them were plotting to assassinate the Prime Minister, flashed the letters that they found on their computers, allegedly found on their computers, across the national media. The media went, and the national media repeated this everywhere, saying, those urban Maoists, Maoists are these they anti-nationals, people who have this long history of underground armed revolution in India, and they're saying, well, basically these guys are not in the forest now, they're in the cities, they could be living right next to you. Oh, they're next to you on the train, see that person wearing a lovely jute bag, actually that person could be a Maoist terrorist. And anyway, go and throw these people in prison. And then, as the book kind of uncovers, it's found out that actually the evidence used to incarcerate them was implanted on their computers. And so I started to, look at this case and what it said about Indian democracy, and who are these people, and what were they doing, and why were they so dangerous. And I knew some of the people before they were incarcerated because of my own deep anthropological research in India, fieldwork in India. And as I worked on all of them, I discovered there's a pattern. So they're all working on either the protection of the rights of indigenous people, tribal people. There's 100 million tribal people in India, Adivasis, they call themselves, forest dwellers, whose lands are India's largest mineral reserve. So some of the coal reserves, there's bauxite, there's mica, there's diamonds, there's basically most of India's mineral reserves, the important reserves, are under their territory. So most of a large section of the people who were arrested, they were working to fight the mining corporations from taking over the lands of indigenous people, aided by the Indian state. They were also fighting for the rights of India's previously stigmatized and vilified untouchable populations who call themselves Dalits, and they were fighting against caste oppression, 200 million Dalits in India. And they were fighting for the rights of the other large minority in India, or minority which is very significantly under the regime's radar at the moment, which are the Muslim population, which is 200 million Muslims in India. It's one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. And under the Modi regime, Muslims in particular have been made into second-class citizens. Their autonomy and citizenship has been stripped away. and the others, the Adivasis and Dalits, some of them are sitting on these precious resources. They need to be got out of the way. That the Dalits, they were allying forces with left parties, so they needed to be brought into the Hindu fold and be made into proper Hindus. So they were really targeting those intellectuals, journalists, artists, activists who were fighting for the rights of these three minorities, and who are in a way quintessential democratic rights activists in India. India has a large tradition of democratic rights activism. In the 1970s, there was this dark period called the Indian Emergency, where Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, suspended all constitutional rights and liberties, and there was, many people were thrown into jail, and it was, Prime Minister's rule over the country. And after that period, which was a very dark period, many people lost their lives and many people were jailed. Democratic rights activists all over the country said, we don't ever want to see this happening in the country. So everywhere in the country, there are people who sacrifice their lives, their labor, who are not paid. They don't have, there's no money coming from NGOs, or all they have is the labor of their sacrifice in their lives, and they're working all over the country. And so these people represented these democratic rights activists. So they were thrown into prison. And subsequently, the judiciary was like terrible. Questions were raised by Indian professors. Many intellectuals across the country said, we have to stop this from happening. These are democratic rights activists. Now this is the collapse of democracy in India. If you arrest these people, it's a real sign of, the collapse of democracy in India. But 6 years later, we find that many of these people are still in prison. Those who have been let out on bail very slowly are still living in very kind of constrained. Their freedoms are very constrained. There's no trial all this time later. Anti-terror laws, which allow this to happen. And one person, this wonderful Jesuit priest by the name of Stan Swami, who I knew, 83 years old, put in prison under COVID, during the COVID regime, during the COVID pandemic, and died 6 months later, having caught COVID in prison. It's like really, really tragic story. 30 years had devoted his life to fighting for indigenous rights, to fighting the mining corporations for taking over indigenous lands. So what you see through these people is a story of like great tragedy, because it's a story of how under the current regime all of these kinds of democratic rights activists have been silenced. So the silencing of 16 prominent people across the country means everyone else it's a message to everyone that basically this could happen to you. So there's been a lot of self-silencing that takes place after this. But what you also see through this case is the extraordinary weaponry of an authoritarian regime. So you see how the media was completely complicit in presenting the police version of the story. You see how the judiciary, just the cases would come up in the courts and judges would just recuse themselves from hearing the cases. Or so it's been very, very hard for any of the bail cases, applications to get heard. And you see the instruments of vigilantes on the street used to police people. You also see, invisible forms of warfare, which is cyber warfare, because it turns out that the police are deeply implicated in the implantation of evidence that was found on the computers. So there's this whole trail of evidence which shows how these letters, the assassination plot letter, has never been brought up in the court since. Why? It was so clearly adopted, and many people raised questions of these letters when they were first peddled by the police, but actually now there is evidence to show how they were implanted on the computers of those who were arrested and imprisoned. So it's a fascinating case. We think of India as the world's largest democracy. we have welcomed, after a period in which, the UK and the US, the US had banned Modi from going to the United States. We had also not received him here. And that was all for good reason at the time. And suddenly all of that kind of, once he became prime minister, he was welcomed with open arms. We have, we need India. We need India for trade relations. India is not China in certain sections of the imagination of UK and US society. And so India is very, very important. And we think of India as a democracy, and we want it to be a democracy. But I think what this case shows and reveals is how democratic rights activists have been censored and silenced and imprisoned across the country. How actually we've seen a very, very authoritarian regime that has risen, especially in the last 20 years, and the weapons that it's used to completely undermine democratic structures in Indian society.
Modi's BJP saw its majority in India's parliament slashed in the June elections and now governs only with support from its coalition partners. Do you think that humbling at the ballot box will curb some of this authoritarian behaviour?
Yes, I think it's mattered. It's mattered that you have to remember that they still got the majority. They didn't lose much of the vote share of the population that they had before. But the fact that they didn't get the number of seats that they hoped has made a difference, because many people feared that they will actually then bring about constitutional changes which remove some of the kind of democratic processes that India has enshrined, in its constitution. And also, I think there have been certain laws that have been kind of difficult to pass in Parliament, because now the questions are raised in Parliament. So, for example, although the mainstream media has been by and large overwhelmingly taken over by the Modi regime and its big corporate houses, what was very influential in these last elections was YouTubers who had now, these were journalists who used to be with mainstream media but who have set up independent news channels, who have set up YouTube channels, who have huge followings, and who are very, very influential in the last election, whose WhatsApp videos, which were critiques of the Modi regime, really spread viral through the country and actually made an impact on how people voted. And so what they've been trying to do is censor, now censor, have censorship on YouTube, what's on YouTube, has broadcasting laws changed to censor these last kind of places where there's freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, to try and censor what goes out there. And those kinds of laws, there's been some questioning over that in Parliament, so it's not been so easy for them to pass these laws. So I think what we see is that they're not going to have an easy ride in bringing about the changes they want to bring about, but also what we see is a kind of strengthening of civil society. I think it's a hopeful moment, because people are okay, we can fight, we have fought. There are people who have dared to speak out, and they have, it's mattered, and so we all should, continue to do that. So I think that kind of opposition, the kind of fear of the repercussions of dissent against the regime, I think that has been dampened somewhat at this moment in time. Although, of course, what did they do straight after the elections? They went and basically said that Arundhati Roy, the Booker Prize winning author, who is a very big critique of the regime, they said that she too could be arrested under these anti-terror laws. That was one of the first moves they made, and of course, vigilante action, lynching of untouchables, lynching of Muslims on the streets is still very much prevalent. So, what's very scary about this regime is the rise it's given to youth on the ground who are really raised by the RSS and its kind of offshoots, and who feel it's their moral duty to protect the nation against Muslims and their beliefs and their, whether it's eating of cows or taking Hindu women, or these are the excuses to lynch people and and they can get away with it because the police is partial. So I think, there's definitely reason for hope, but at the same time, the processes that have already been put in place are very strong, and we still have the BJP and Narendra Modi in power. Yeah.
You mentioned the UK is a big trading partner of India, and the UK is trying to seal a free trade agreement with India at the moment. At the same time, as you say, American companies are increasingly turning to India given the geopolitical tensions with China. Companies like Apple building secondary supply chains. Jamie Dimon, the boss of JP Morgan, America's biggest bank, said at the start of this year the West shouldn't be lecturing India, that Modi's lifted his country up out of poverty, that he's had huge achievements. Do you think the West will keep overlooking what might be called some of the democratic cultural nasties inside India in the name of greater trade, greater economic collaboration?
Yeah, unfortunately, the structure of our world economy is such that, what counts is growth based on extreme inequalities, and trading partnerships are very crucial to, as we know, to our governments, to our corporate elites, which are actually ruling the world. And it's not just our corporate elites, it's corporate elites grown in India, which are now some of the world's, largest multinational corporations, some of the wealthiest people in the world. And so I think that, of course, they're going to overlook and say we shouldn't be critiquing. Indian elites are going to be saying, actually, who are you to critique us? Who are you to raise questions of what's happening in our country? And human rights itself is a kind of colonial narrative, and you also have those kinds of arguments that are being made. But equally, we have a lot of resistance from Western NGOs, from social movements, from environmental justice movements, who have always kept their eye on the human rights abuses that are happening in far corners of the Indian subcontinent, who have drawn attention to, we've had, the London Science Museum had the big Adani Green Energy Gallery, which just opened up, and, that was to a significant protest on the streets, on our streets, right, in the West End. And we had board members of the Science Museum resign over this Adani Green Energy Gallery opening. Adani is Modi's homegrown oligarch. He is one of the people who is responsible for displacing thousands of indigenous people in remote places like the forests of central and eastern India, where many of the BK-16, those who were incarcerated in this case, were fighting his actions on the ground, So although it's impossible to make an exact direct link between them stopping Adani from entering their territories and their incarcerations, there are definitely, big forces at play which has led to their incarcerations. And there are environmental justice movements. There are many activists in the West, journalists too, who have done fantastic work, who have highlighted the connections and who have drawn our attention to the abuses of human rights going on back in India. And so I think, yes, JP Morgan, of course, we're going to have that narrative from our prime ministers and our corporate elites, but equally there is another narrative and a questioning of India going on, both from within the country and outside.